the best case scenario in terms of lacking security guarantees for Ukraine is signing this minerals deal. What the US administration might indeed achieve is a temporary ceasefire. I do see it for 2025 in my outlook. The political leadership in Europe failed to prepare the European population accordingly. Never ever allow your emotions to guide you in terms of what's really important for your country. We will be on our own in the future when it comes to the security and the defense of this continent.
Hello everybody, my name is Paul Buitink and welcome to a new episode of Reinvent Money, a podcast about money and power. My guest today is one of the best European geopolitical experts. She believes it's time for Europe to embrace realpolitik and stop being so emotional. I'm going to discuss with her what happened in the White House on Friday, whether NATO will collapse and how Europe should position itself going forward. Welcome from Austria with Bulgarian roots, Velina Tchakarova.
Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a big honor being with you and discussing all these relevant topics of geopolitics.
Yeah, because I normally mostly talk to American experts and they can, of course, they're not based in Europe, so they're in their comfortable positions at university in the US or whatever. But you and I live in Europe, you live in Austria, I live in the Netherlands. So whatever happens here in Europe does impact us, of course, much more than some of these very interesting and brilliant American experts that I've talked to in the past. So I'm very interested in getting your perspective. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about what happened last Friday in the White House. What's your analysis? There was a shouting contest between Trump and Zelensky and Vance. What did you make of it?
So it really depends on where your location is, how you will interpret what happened on that day. Because if you sit in Washington, if you are an analyst from the United States, you have one specific analysis of what happened, especially given your background. Are you actually someone rooting for the new US administration, which has a very different way of doing things, also in the diplomatic domain? Or are you also someone who is with the background of the opposition? Then, of course, if you're sitting in some European capital, your perspective will be completely different from the one of your American counterparts. And then, of course, if you are in Ukraine, you will get a third perspective. So it depends really on which one you want to get. But let me just leave this aside, because we've got all these readings, right? We've got all this coverage, all the versions, from humiliation, which it was, of course, the perception in Ukraine. Most of the Ukrainian colleagues have been completely shocked. They've been reaching out, asking what really was, the agenda of this specific act. Then we know for a fact how the governments in the European Union members reacted, especially also the institutions. And we know also how the interpretation was of the Trump J.D. Vance administration, but also the opposition. So let me leave this aside and let me just focus on the geopolitical takeaway of what happened. So first thing that happened from my own perspective and perception was the very fact that this meeting ended without the signing of this important, from my perspective, again, minerals deal. Why, you would ask, is this deal so important, given the disadvantages that also have been discussed ahead of the preparation of the deal? And I would argue that from geopolitical perspective right now, the best case scenario in terms of lacking security guarantees for Ukraine is signing this minerals deal. Signing this minerals deal. I think that this is very controversial point, and I'm ready to discuss it with other colleagues. But in reality, right now, one of the big problems we have in terms of the continuous war is the reality of missing security guarantees. And I mean, of course, credible ones. I do not mean those on paper, because we can get 20 bilateral deals being signed between Ukraine and individual European Union members. Now, what would you evaluate as someone who is not in the world of geopolitics? Let's say someone who is an investor, someone who is is operating international business. If there is the United States a signatory on the paper, bringing in, obviously American business presence on the ground, American labor and American representatives. And yes, of course, we can discuss that these are not explicit security guarantees. And this was the big problem because President Zelensky went to Washington with the idea to convince this administration that the war, no matter the US efforts towards a ceasefire, towards any peace plan with Russia in the short term, is going to continue in the long term.
Yeah, because such mineral deals, for example, how would it... I understand that in the long run, if the US has firms there and companies and boots on the ground, like employees working there, or there's a strong relationship, economical ties between the countries, I understand why Russia would be hesitant then to keep on fighting in those areas where Americans are also present. But it's if in order to for that to happen, it will take time, right? Signing a minerals deal will not directly yield into a security guarantee, so it will still give the Russians, I guess, enough time and an opportunity to keep on fighting and to keep on gaining territory, for example. Or how would you see that?
So going back to this minerals deal, first and foremost, you need to understand the geopolitical context. Why is it suddenly so important for the so-called big powers to actually go after all possibilities to get an access to critical raw materials? Not just rare earths, because in the case of Ukraine, it was presented as a rare earths deal, but in reality, there are critical raw materials there. It's not just rare earths. And the rare earths are not even credibly confirmed because the report comes from Ukraine, and there are apparently, this is at least what was being reported, there are no international, geological institutes confirming this information. But if you take a look at, what Ukraine has to offer in terms of critical raw materials, you get the idea that here there is more than just a mineral deal. It is about the access to a country that can offer leverage and meet the fourth industrial revolution, in which China has already 70% share of production of most of these important raw materials. If you take a look at the numbers and the dependencies of the European Union members on China, for instance, when it comes to imports of rare earths and also other, production of important critical raw materials, you will be astonished how significant the share is. In the case of rare earths imports, up to 98%. So now we are in this context of fourth industrial revolution, the winner takes all. We need to secure critical access. So every spot on the map matters. So this is how I would argue the US administration wants to sell this to its own audience, because this administration was elected to revive the American industry and to nationalize, so to say, to have a new national agenda of how to create competitive US economy. And for that matter, being in a fourth industrial revolution, you need all these critical assets.
I get it from a US perspective, but how would it directly or in the short run benefit the Ukraine in terms of security guarantees? Because do you think after signing such a deal, Russia would directly cease fire or would stop hostilities? And that's still the point I don't get. How would it benefit Ukraine in the short run in terms of security?
So first, you have a selling pitch for the American audience, because this administration, contrary to the previous one, is one that actually wants to act, in the interest of its own voters. So this is the selling pitch at home. But of course, there is more to it. And that is that the Americans want to secure their presence in Ukraine without committing militarily, because there are certain points which I would argue we don't know the facts yet. There have been 2 rounds of negotiations between the United States and Russia, where the Europeans were sidelined, Ukraine was not invited. One was in Saudi Arabia, and one was in Turkey, in Turkey, as it's the new name of the country. And probably one of the most important points for this bilateral agenda was to commit to not having military presence on the ground on behalf of the United States. So that means no US troops on the ground, which was also part of the US campaign of Trump. And then, of course, no NATO membership and all of the other points that we will be discussing. So here, this is the combination. We cannot offer you security guarantees, explicit security guarantees, but we can offer you implicit ones by being involved on the ground for a very long period of time. This is, I think, the selling pitch also to Ukraine. And by doing so, we can actually indirectly contribute to the fact that Russia would never, ever attack territories where Americans are on the ground.
Okay, so if the Ukraine would sign the deal, then I guess quite soon after, Americans would be sent to Ukraine as a security guarantee, business people, politicians, diplomats, or bureaucrats, in order to kind of live up to the mineral deal and provide some sort of implicit security guarantee. So no military boots on the ground, but
yes, this would be my expectation in terms of the chronology of expected events. Now, first and foremost, we need to understand that, again, it's a matter of perspective. If you look at the U.S. goal for Ukraine, first and foremost, Ukraine is not a priority of this administration. I know it sounds very dramatic, especially given the perception and especially given the fact that we are in Europe. But that is the reality. Ukraine is not a priority of this administration. So this is the first. Russia is a priority. The revival of the strategic dialogue with Russia is a US priority in terms of global geopolitics. Why? Because this administration has a lot of China hawks. The biggest priority is China, and the biggest geographic area of US activities is going to be the Indo-Pacific for the next 3 to 4 years. And here they see an opportunity. And the opportunity is to revive a strategic dialogue with Russia, to lure Russia away from China, because they are now aware of this, what I've been coining for the last 10 years, since 2015, dragon bear modus operandi of strategic coordination in all systemically relevant domains between China and Russia. Now, this administration is aware of it, and it wants to tackle it. Okay, so this is the perspective now from the US administration, meaning that for this year, they want a ceasefire. You can call it whatever you like. You can call it peace plan. You can call it,
truce or whatever. But do you think then if then Zelensky, for example, offers his apologies, signs the deal? I already saw that Ukrainian Prime Minister, I believe, said they should just sign it. So if we would follow that order, possibly apologies, signing the deal. Also, I think Zelensky needs to accept the fact that at least everything that's occupied right now will be, at least for the foreseeable future, have to be surrendered. If those steps are going to be taken over the next few weeks or so, would indeed then the Trump administration be successful and arrange some sort of peace treaty for now?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. So what the US administration might indeed achieve is a temporary ceasefire. I do see it for 2025 in my outlook. I have no doubts that there will be that Ukraine and the United States will sign this minerals deal, which again, I want to highlight, is a good thing. It's a good thing for Ukraine. By the way, no matter all the emotions here on the old continent. And in the end, the ceasefire will do exactly that. It will provide a window of opportunity. And this window of opportunity means seizure of hostilities on both sides, which indirectly means legitimization of Russia-controlled territories. Around 18% right now are under Russian control. It will mean concessions because in the end, we know for a fact, based on the past actions, especially in Ukraine, that ceasefires have been violated. 29 ceasefires were agreed on between Ukraine and Russia in the period between 2014, following the first invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and 2022. 29 ceasefires. This is what ceasefires mean, and this is what actually Ukrainian President Zelensky tried to convey to this administration. But again, it's a matter of perspective, because for this administration, Ukraine being not a priority means also it should not become a liability. It should not become a weakness on the geographic map, given the priorities I've outlined.
Exactly.
So,
but just to make sure, the minerals deal will lead to a ceasefire shortly after, you think?
I think that it will set the stage for the next steps, being that that the United States has to also bring Russia into the process. And for that, I expect that there will be some sort of territorial concessions, political concessions. On behalf of Ukraine will be pressured into certain concessions, for the sake of this negotiation process. Russia will be offered carrots. It will be offered goodies, stuff that, Moscow was aiming for the last 3 years. The question mark I have here is whether Ukraine will be offered the so-called neutrality status. And let's not forget that Ukraine was neutral and had neutrality status in 2014 prior to the first aggression. I'm just saying this because there are big fans, especially from the corners of academia, explaining how the NATO expansion led to this beginning of the war, and practically explaining, I will not name names right now, but you will know whom I mean.
I had them as guests, so John Mersheimer, Jeffrey Sachs.
Explaining how Ukraine should be neutralized, should be made neutral as a neutral buffer between NATO and Russia, so that there will be no danger of aggression in the future. And I'm just explaining that we've been there, we've done that. But Russia will be probably offered some relief of sanctions. And that's another expectation I have. And obviously, the biggest, in my view, at least for this year, breakthrough will be if there is a personal meeting between Trump and Putin, where Putin will finally show to the world, look at the Western approach. They wanted to internationally isolate Russia. They wanted to internationally isolate me. And look where I am in 2025. I think that this is going to be the breakthrough. So US administration is working on 2 tracks right now. The one being Ukraine, the other being actually Russia. And the Europeans being sidelined in this process, I think that from American perspective, it worked quite well, because this administration aggravated the transatlantic partners to the point that now they are announcing on a free base the 4 to 5% increase of defense spending, 4 to 5% of GDP, of course. Plus, the institutions are stepping in with another 800 billion. And this is exactly what Trump was aiming for right at the beginning, where he wants the Europeans to finally take care of their own security. But why, you would ask, is this the case? And I think that the most important message, again, because of all the emotions, it was left out at the Munich Security Conference, where J.D. Vance, sort of made his first appearance on the European arena. And everybody was talking about his speech. But for me, there was only one important geopolitical takeaway. Again, only geopolitical highlights. And that was the clear message that the US is withdrawing from the old continent. It means significant shift in terms of planning, military planning. It means in terms of security, in terms of political leadership, because we will be on our own in the future when it comes to the security and the defense of this continent.
Does it mean, in your view, that NATO will become obsolete, or you think NATO will continue to exist, but it will be divided into two branches, for example, where you have a European NATO, still part of the big NATO, taking care of European business? What's your view on the NATO in that sense?
Well, the majority of NATO members are European members. The interoperability, the scale, the scope of interoperability, the structures, they are in place. There is nothing closer in terms of structure, interoperability to the European NATO. Leave the NATO aside in terms of the American leadership, participation, and contribution and commitments, which are significant, no doubt about it. But I think that all these conversations, and they have been ongoing for a very, very long time, 20 plus years, towards European strategic autonomy, towards European Union Army, and so on and so forth. I think that they are still at the same level as they were, even 3 years ago or 10 years ago. So I just don't see, of course, I can talk nicely, because it sounds so nice if I tell how important it will be to have European Union Army. But I am someone coming from the realpolitik angle. So I talk facts and I present the most realistic scenario to your audience. And the most realistic scenario, from my perspective, is that there will be still the same structures of the very same NATO, probably under different leadership, in place. Especially, and here is my next working hypothesis, that is that given this global power shifts, we've been talking about US versus China and Russia, so Cold War 2.0 kind of context between United States on the one hand and the Dragon Bear on the other. Where will be the new Iron Curtain in this geopolitical context? It will be along the eastern flank of NATO, now starting with even more NATO members than 3 years ago, thanks to the strategic thinking of the Russian President Putin, because he was in fact the one who unleashed the next wave of NATO. It was not NATO expansion this time, as some academia have been claiming. It was a voluntary, and it came bottom up, straight from the majority of the population of countries like Finland and Sweden. So starting from these countries and then moving along the eastern flank of NATO, which are the Baltic countries, Poland, so a lot of Central Eastern European countries, moving to Romania, which has a very, very big border with Ukraine, Bulgaria, which is also Black Sea nation, and then ending where? Turkey, which is actually now, and it has been a key NATO member because it provides the second largest NATO army. You'll see that suddenly you have very different constellations and you have very strong common interest to preserve the structures for the sake of stability and security along this common border. With whom? With Russia. Because even in the case of ceasefire, like I said, this war will continue beyond 2027, 2028. Who knows, maybe beyond 2030, this war will be flared up once again.
Yeah, because you think Russia will regroup, will invest time, money in their own defenses, and at some point continue the war. That's what you forecast, right? But Absolutely. At the same time, we didn't see that happening in Georgia either, right? Because following your logic, shouldn't Russia have already taken over Georgia completely by now, militarily?
Well, first and foremost, the borders of Georgia, the border that has been violated by Russia, has been shifting since actually the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. Just because most recently it was about the political turmoil of in Georgia, but not so much about these realities. But there are two breakaway republics also, which are under Russian influence to some extent. There are other territories in the post-Soviet republics and in those post-Soviet, satellites, as they were, used to be described, where there are plenty of examples of different kind of Russian influence. So you do not need necessarily to start an aggression.
Like in Belarus, for example. Eh?
You see how costly aggression is. You see that even after 3 years and hundreds of thousands of human loss, this is the most devastating war since the end of the Second World War. By all means, ask any military expert, and they will tell you the same story. It's the most devastating war. Wars of this kind of scale are always systemic risk. And this is something that investors specifically tend to underestimate, because we've been operating in the context of military conflicts all the time, right? Every week you hear about new headlines of new military conflict being flared up here or there on all continents. But wars of that scale are systemic risks, similarly to pandemics, and similarly to what happened with the great financial/economic crisis. And this is the most underestimated systemic risk.
I totally agree. That's also why I like to talk to guys like you, to experts on geopolitical matters, because I know it matters to our financial system, to all the other things that we discuss on my show, whether it's gold or the dollar. All of these things are highly influenced, of course, by what's happening in the global theater and the outcome of the wars, and especially the war in Ukraine. It just fascinates me so much, because it's, first of all, awful what happens over there, but also it has such great implications on the financial system and on Europe. One more question about NATO involvement. What if so we have like what you forecast? Perhaps we have the minerals deal, then we set the stage for a ceasefire. Then Trump and Putin would likely meet, but then also there would be the question of perhaps sending European troops to Ukraine as an extra security guarantee. But it could lead then to hostilities between Russia and those European troops. If that leads to hostilities, then doesn't the US automatically become involved again because of NATO? Because if European troops are attacked by Russia, then Article 5, NATO is involved as well. Or do you see that differently?
I see it differently, because I think that what the US and Russia, and again, it's about the hierarchy of negotiations, because you need to differentiate between three different tiers of or dimensions of negotiation. US, Russia, China is the systemic negotiation level. This is the big game. And then you have middle powers. The European Union countries are middle powers. The European Union as a whole is a geoeconomic power, global geoeconomic power, but no geopolitical player. Thus, it's a middle power. And then you have Turkey and others, which are very important. Ukraine is a third-tier negotiation dimension. It's a victim of one of the most significant aggressions of the modern international relations, by all means, and yet it doesn't have the clout to, vouch for itself. Without the comprehensive military and any other kind of support, it will be practically put in the position to capitulate. That is the reality. So here, coming back to your question, you need to understand that most likely what will be agreed on to this ceasefire will guarantee some sort of stability, at least in the short term. That means that Russia will not be inclined into any kind of risky actions. There will be a demarcation line. There will be international troops presence along this demarcation line, some sort of South Korea, North Korea kind of solution with ceasefire, but no peace agreement.
Yeah, a frozen conflict.
Yes, and this frozen conflict means that right now there are discussions on behalf of the European powers to actually send troops to this part of Ukraine that's not under Russian control at all. So it doesn't make sense. The whole narrative doesn't make sense to me when, experts claim that the deployment of European troops, which is presented as NATO, on that part of Ukraine that is actually not under Russian control, should immediately result in a direct clash between NATO and Russia. Because for that to happen, it means that Russia is deliberately violating the ceasefire, moving along, this crossing the demarcation zone, and then entering territories of Ukraine that haven't been under Russian control prior to the ceasefire. That will be the next logical step for Russia in this escalatory path in the future, if Russia really means what it actually strived to achieve 3 years ago. And I would argue that it still sticks to the same plan of a complete political, economic, and social subjugation of Ukraine. And for that to happen, then we will see a violation of the ceasefire. We will see actually crossing of the demarcation zone and then moving into territories of Ukraine. And here, of course, the question is, what happens with these international troops, right? And there are, first and foremost, a lot of speculations right now, because on behalf of the political leadership in Europe, we haven't seen much courage so far to act accordingly, right? So yes, now we've seen from the summit in London, 20,000 troops were proposed by France and UK to be sent to Ukraine.
Yeah.
But
random countries, where they were labeled as such by JD Vance. Yeah, but it's very insignificant then.
So between announcement and action, there is a long way.
Yeah.
You understand very well that the mood in Europe is a very different one. In fact, I will go a step further by claiming that the political leadership in Europe failed to prepare the European population accordingly. It did not communicate what was happening. It did not communicate to the people that on the 24th of February 2022, there wasn't only an all-in war, conventional war, launched by Russia on Ukraine. It was, in fact, a non-conventional war officially launched by Russia on the European Security Order. That means you, I, everyone else listening to us is actually part of this non-conventional war.
So does it mean you would have,
if you would have, without military means? This is
but if you would have been in charge 3 years ago, you would be at the helm. Would have you gone all in then when it comes to military support from Europe to Ukraine, or you think we've been too soft and not sending enough?
Yes, I would have gone all in terms of military support. First and foremost, announcing partial war economy, mostly in those parts of Europe that are closer to Ukraine, in order to facilitate a sustainable long-term lifeline of military aid to Ukraine. What is missing right now? Without this lifeline, you see, Ukraine is being put into this impossible, position that the Ukrainian president has to go to Washington and back, literally, for support. And you know what the reaction was, by the way? The immediate reaction was to announce that military support for Ukraine will be temporarily halted. So you get the idea of how important this is. This is the first. The second that I will have done is exactly what the president of the European Commission is doing right now, immediately announcing. So first and foremost, redistributing all these billions and trillions that we actually announced at that time, if you remember, for decarbonization and green agendas that are meant to happen somewhere in 20, 30 years. Even though that, as I said, we were and we are still in an existential security crisis. And for that matter, I will have, of course, involved both European Union members, but also non-European Union members, because we have also candidate countries. We have the whole Western Balkan, where you can actually present the whole idea as reviving defense industry that creates new jobs and creates new opportunities. And because in these parts of Europe, you have very different conditions when it comes to labor costs and so on and so forth, you have actually kind of whole spillover positive effect.
Yeah, but you have, for example, von der Leyen talked about ReArm Europe. So I'm not sure, but I saw 150 billion, but I also saw 800 billion. So you would say just use the existing budget, but instead of spending the money on the Green Deal or a sustainable a green future, you say spend the money on military support and investing in the arms industry. Yeah.
Exactly, for the time being. And because we are so ideological in Europe, a lot of our party politics and a lot of, in general, politics in Europe is based on emotions. It's very short-term oriented. You need to just push the right buttons and you need to, send the right messages. A lot was actually, and is still, about ideology, party ideology. It was absolutely unthinkable to do that because these political leaders were afraid of their own voters. They were afraid of losing votes. And what happened is that in the end, they lost, in many of the cases, they lost elections because of the precarious negative effects from the systemic risk being this kind of comprehensive war after 3 years. Because you look at the war and you think, and most of the people in Europe think, that war is only being waged by military means with weapons and with casualties. But the non-conventional part of this war, meaning actually instrumentalizing all the dependencies. You remember very well probably how at the beginning commodities were weaponized to create, to use a leverage over your competitor, like oil and gas, fertilizers, food commodities were used actually also to get, for instance, the right political voting in international organizations and so on and so forth. There are countless examples. The instrumentalization of nuclear blackmail for the very first time in the history of international relations, modern international relations, we saw the precedent that a country was threatening with the use of nuclear weapons.
Are you not afraid of that? Because you said earlier we should have just helped Ukraine with much more than we did. And of course, people like Jeffrey Sachs that I also talked to said there's a huge risk of nuclear escalation. Does it ever scare you that if we would send long-term missiles to Ukraine and they would use them to hit targets deep in Russia, that it could eventually lead to the end of humanity? Is that something that worries you?
Of course, it worries me on personal matter. But as a professional who follows the exact developments linked to this kind of risks, I can assure our audience that the risk of a direct nuclear exchange between Russia and NATO states hasn't increased over the last 3 years. The incentive of a direct military conflict between Russia and NATO countries hasn't increased in the last 3 years. Okay, these are very important statements I want to make. So that means that the risk of the use of nuclear weapons is imminent since the very first tests of nuclear weapons. And yet, if you take a look at all preparations, all possible, steps that you need to launch a nuclear weapon, there hasn't been such movements. What we had was a risk of nuclear catastrophe because of the war dynamics in Ukraine. There were fears that, for instance, a nuclear power plant might face the situation of an attack. And even this case, where there wasn't a heightened risk of nuclear catastrophe, there wasn't explicit risk of, let me put it differently, the security around the nuclear power plant, in this case, Zaporizhzhia, has been still 24 hours, 7 days a week observed and verified by international organizations, but also by nuclear experts, nuclear security experts, people who actually follow these kind of things.
And apart from that, you think like updating the nuclear doctrine by Putin, or some of the threats levied by him or Medvedev or any of the other Russian officials was all empty then?
Of course, it's not empty. It has to be considered. It has to be considered and regarded as a significant step towards escalation. No doubt about it. It has to be taken seriously. But I'm pointing to concrete steps, escalatory steps, preparation for, let's say, nuclear exchange, or if you like, a preparation for direct military conflict, direct military clash between Russian forces and NATO troops. And these are verified realities from the last 3 years. We had the escalation of narrative. That's why I gave you the example with the nuclear backpayal. We had an escalation as a sort of psychological effect, mostly on the population in the West, because people are not used to war. And people still remember the tragic events of, let's say, Chernobyl from 1986, or, of course, the fear of something like the Cuban Missile Crisis. So they have this memory, and there is a psychological game, which is why I'm giving you this example to just exemplify how non-conventional warfare is being waged by other means, and quite effectively, quite successfully, because then you have all these public speakers pointing to World War III, which is absolutely not realistic. And let me also highlight for our audience that there is zero incentive on behalf of the United States, China, and Russia, as we speak, to get engaged directly in a military confrontation against each other. I think these are important realities.
Yeah.
So,
and then going back to Europe and the ReArm plan of von der Leyen, would you be okay with the fact if it would be financed by eurobonds? So let's say they would come up with another fund, like a next generation fund, where they put in 800 billion financed by eurobonds. Do you think there's support for that within Europe?
Yes, absolutely. I think that we passed the Rubicon, and this is a major event.
But in Holland, for example, the coalition is currently against that. Also in Germany, of course, there's resistance, especially after the big win of AfD. So, on the one hand, voters in different European countries are saying we want to basically hold back the further federalization of Europe. On the other hand, first we had COVID, now we have the war. So there's always an opportunity for Europe to grow and to become more of a political union. And I get it, why it would make sense perhaps, but at the same time, there's democracy, right? There's people having a certain view of what society needs to look like. And so it seems to go against the wishes of a lot of voters, at least in West and Northern Europe. So how would you deal with that?
Yes, it goes back to my explanation why, of course, voters, being European citizens, have very different expectations from their political leaders, because their political leaders who were in charge, some of them are still in charge, haven't communicated to explain to them what was really at stake right from the beginning. Meaning that if we do not start to strengthen our defense and we do not secure our own neighborhood, we will invite more aggression. We will send a message to those who are looking at us as a potential arena of competition. They will carve piece by piece, and they will use and apply, the old tactics of rule, and divide, carving a country by country and trying to destroy all of the cohesion of this project, which was a project right from the beginning, was a peace project, was exactly meant to avoid any war in the future on the old continent. So here, my thesis is the following. If we do not invest now for security and defense, nobody else is going to be there for us to take care of our defense. The Americans are very clear on the matter. And I do not think that it's just a matter of Trump versus Democrat candidate in the future narrative.
Yeah,
I would argue that a future administration, because if you take a look at what Biden administration did on the China portfolio, he pretty much actually continued most of the policies of Trump, because there is unbiased bipartisan agreement on what's really important. And let's be honest about it. Biden, in fact, supported Ukraine. Yes, indeed, comprehensively. But at the same time, the administration provided only as little as needed. And at the same time, the whole 3 years, they were just propagating the narrative that Russia is not supposed to undergo any political turmoil or dissolve itself, because it could be a significant risk, which actually means that this administration, the previous one, also did not perceive Russia as a systemic risk. So going back to the point, my point is that nobody else is going to be there for us. And in 3 years from now, 5 years from now, having this precarious global competition, we are going to turn into the geopolitical backyard of global events, where we will have to invest 10 times more for the same matter of security and defense than we will do now. And this, of course, is very important to convey as a message. But at the same time, it's understandable that European citizens will not understand, because European citizens, they have grown and got accustomed to the idea that somebody else is taking care of our security, somebody else is providing our cheap resources, somebody else is providing cheap goods and gives us access to their markets, and we can take care of our welfare systems. These,
but there's several other alternatives, right? That, like, for example, we don't necessarily have to issue more eurobonds and increase Brussels budget. Every member state itself can invest in its army. And of course, you can buy collectively in order to get better deals. You should standardize things, but we don't need the European Union or von der Leyen to boost our defense spending. And secondly, Hungary, for example, is also proving that you can also, by trying to befriend everyone and optimize trade with everyone, you don't necessarily have to choose sides. And a third alternative that I would also like to get your view on, why not just Trump and just let America be on its own and try to engage with China and set up a security arrangement with China, maybe join SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There's, of course, many other things we could contemplate, right? I would love to get your view on those three different scenarios.
Yeah. So first scenario, whether the European Union should also participate and should actually take play a role in this, or would it be better to leave it to the member states? Right. This is the first question you have. And here, of course, if you leave it up to the member states, you will get 27 different perspectives on every geopolitical problem in the world. Mostly, they are absolutely not on the same page. And I think that the best example is the fact that they did not even arrive at strategic consensus as to what the ultimate goal in this war should be from European perspective.
But that proves my point. You can't work together because you are so. The interests are so different. Our culture is so different that you can try to become this union, but if the voters say no, then who are you fooling in the end?
Yes, and the point here is that Ukraine formulated its ultimate goal in the war with one single sentence, and even this was not the basis for strategic consensus on behalf of the European member states, because Ukraine said, we want to regain all territories as per our internationally recognized borders of 1991. Very simple. You see, and then moving from member state to member state, you will find different interpretation and different perspective. Then look at China. Right now, China, that is capitalizing on this transatlantic, divide, and immediately reaching out to different European capitals, trying, to make the best for itself. And again, you see there is a clear difference in the in the perception. And the same goes for the United States, because there are some countries that look at the United States as the sole guarantor of their security, the sole guarantor. It's not NATO. They are in NATO because of the United States, and vice versa. There are countries that look at the United States, and now even more so, as it's this kind of antithesis of what the European Union has been striving to be as a global power, right? With all the soft power and all of the rest of the agenda. So here, I don't see a clear trend projection going into the one or the other direction. Member states versus institutions. I think it's going to be a kind of combined approach, where the institutions will be still in charge to some extent. Defense policy hasn't been really a European Union portfolio. In fact, the common security and defense policy of the European Union has been a kind of orphan of let's say, the European Union institutions. If you compare it to other portfolios where hundreds of billions were dedicated, if you take a look at the last budget of the European Union, the least of all dimensions of the budget was dedicated to the security and defense. Now, this is what I meant is changing. There is a shift in the understanding of the institutions that they have to provide more, that have to facilitate the process. Look at it a little bit as the enlargement process, because again, the enlargement process is one of the most successful endeavors of the European Commission. Here, the Commission will step in and will try to facilitate between the member states, because very often it's difficult, especially for the small member states. Small-scale industrial sector is very difficult to, overcome these differences. We have a very fractured and very fragmented defense sector in Europe. It's not one, production line for each of the military equipments and so on and so forth. So this is where I see the role of the European institutions, not as they did with the green agenda. But again, let me convey this message. Something has to give. You have an equation in which you want to revive the European competitiveness and reindustrialize the continent. You want to boost security and defense. Each one of these portfolios would amount to 800 billion, according to most current statements, annually. And then you want to actually achieve the decarbonization, to be the first continent that has that will have decarbonized, right? So something has to give, because we do not have this money in Europe, in the European Union and in the member states' budgets. And we have, of course, devastating demographic picture, and we have growing social welfare demands. All of this put together doesn't look really too promising. So something will be prioritized at the cost of other portfolios. So I would go with the main scenario by claiming that I think that green agenda will be the big victim. Short term will be the big victim of these ambitions. So this is...
Yeah, I think the Green Deal is dead in that sense. And what do you think of my suggestion of perhaps teaming up with China? Because clearly we cannot trust the Yankees anymore with them doing a rug pull. And basically, although it can all be, of course, part of the negotiations, but I agree with you that Europe is sort of left to its own devices by the US. Given China's size and importance, is it that odd to think you should team up with China?
So here, of course, it depends on what your reading is of the global geopolitical context. If you look at the definition coming from Brussels, China is to be regarded as partner, economic competitor, and strategic rival. So pick your poison.
Or change the definition. Or change the definition, right? I mean, clearly, the US is not the partner anymore that they used to be, right? So it's time for a new mindset, I would say, new definitions.
Why would you rely on the increasingly assertive and aggressive Chinese communist leadership that actually seeks the rejuvenation of its own country and nation, and wants to become victorious in the fourth industrial revolution? Why? Because in the previous industrial revolutions, the winner took all. So practically it enabled the winner to become a global power. So China understands that it has to win this competition with the United States. And it's a competition taking place in the technological domain, in the trade domain, in the financial domain that you mentioned, in the domain of international organizations and institutions, in the domain of capital markets, global diplomacy, regional diplomacy, supremacy over, or let's put it differently, role over the global south, and so on and so forth. So why do you think that siding with China would give bigger leverage to the European powers in this competition between the United States and the Dragon Bear? And siding with China means, by extension, siding with Russia. Again, it's a matter of perspective. There are populist forces on the left and on the right side of the political spectrum in many of the European countries that are increasingly convinced that this might be the way forward. I come from a country, I was born on the other side of the Iron Curtain. We were fighting the bad capitalists and we were fighting NATO and so on and so forth. I can tell you that I have a direct comparison between the two systems. So from the perspective of a citizen, there is no middle ground. You cannot actually replace the one with the other. And you cannot actually justify any of the advantages of the former Soviet bloc.
Yeah,
or the sake of what the disadvantages on every individual and whole families. There is not a single family that wasn't affected one way or the other by the regime. So all we know, of course, I do understand that ideologically there is this kind of appeal because it's something unknown to somebody who hasn't lived in this system.
But it's also maybe realpolitik, right? You're a big fan of realpolitik. I'm also just trying to think rational here, like giving all the options at hand, what would make the most sense for Europe in the long run, given that we are not really able to unite?
Or something differently and different. And that would be if I were to consult this leadership in Brussels and in the member states, in the key member states, I would go a third way right now. Let's assume that the relationship with the United States, I wouldn't go for direct confrontation with the United States and Trump. I don't think that this is a smart, from realpolitik perspective, this is not a smart way. Never ever allow your emotions to guide you in terms of what's really important for your country in terms of interests and strategy. But okay, there is a middle way because there are a lot of middle powers right now oscillating between these two blocks, trying to not get caught in this binary world. Nobody wants a binary world. We do not want a binary world, as I explained, but there are others, such as India, such as Southeast Asian countries, that are now currently facing these binary choices every day.
Yeah.
And then there are countries in Latin America and Africa which want only one thing, and that is development, economic development, not the growth, not green agenda. They want development opportunities for their families and for their societies, communities and societies. So my point is we have a third option, and that is to reach out to those in a similar position like us, because we have the geo-economic cloud as a collective actor to still engage in free trade agreements. Think of Milei. Milei is an absolute fan of the European Union and the member states when it comes to the free liberal economic model, right? And he, in fact, engaged together with other Mercosur countries in Latin America, and they signed a deal when it comes to free trade. It was actually the opposition coming from individual member states that prevented it from happening for the last 12 years. But now it's a fact. India is also on the rise. India is the fastest growing economy in the world, is going to stay the fastest growing economy probably for many years now, and is going to become probably world economy number 3. And India is taking the best from both worlds. It's not siding with the Americans. neither it is siding with Russia, China, but it's participating in both blocks and structures and organizations. So here we have options. What we need to do is develop the missing infrastructure, not just the defense industry, the missing infrastructures north-south from the northern countries, Scandinavian countries, and then Central Eastern European countries up to Greece, Turkey, now that we have also another ceasefire that is in the Middle East, in Gaza. There are plenty of opportunities, but we still lack the infrastructure, the energy corridors, the transport corridors to connect north-south instead of the traditional old west-east way of creating corridors and connectivity.
Yeah, well, it's good that you mentioned also India, because sometimes with everything going on, we seem to forget about this huge powerhouse with so much perspective and growth opportunities, and also for us as Europeans to work with them. So let me just wrap it up here, Velina. I know we've been talking already for an hour, but it was fascinating to get a completely different perspective on what most of my guests have been sharing with me over the past few months. So I really liked it. I thank you for what you do, and it kind of makes me hopeful in a way that Europe can make a difference at some point again and can be strong enough. At the same time, I'm also realistic in terms of whether we're able or not to really unite as a continent, because just so many different interests and within all these different nations, and it's difficult to get everyone on the same page. And I'm not sure if that will ever happen to such an extent that we can become a geopolitical powerhouse. Where can people find more about you? Because your company is called Face, right?
Yes. So I have a boutique consulting company. I work predominantly with private clients, mostly investors, hedge fund managers, board members who want to have an additional perspective on the current geopolitical developments. And it's based here in Austria. A face means for a conscious experience, because I really pick very carefully my clients in terms of meaningful connection that goes in both directions. I, of course, am also very active. I comment a lot. I provide a lot of insights on social media. You can find me on LinkedIn or on Twitter, what works at X. Sorry, Alan, what works for you? But, obviously, there are also a lot of media inquiries. So I have also now the opportunity to even reach out to your home country and just give them an interview for a leading media platform in the Netherlands. So
the NRC,
NRC. So, but I'm an independent expert, and I'm not bound to any international organizations or countries. I would describe myself as a very passionate European, incorporating so many different mentalities, because as you rightfully pointed out, I am originally from Bulgaria. I got all my education in Germany, my high school education, my university education. So I have also very German mentality in terms of doing things. And then, of course, I've spent a lot of time in Austria. I'm Austrian citizen. I've been also supporting Austrian institutions here for quite some time now. So, that is, I think, what describes all of us. And I really like this diversity. I do not want us all to be kind of a conglomerate of unilateral opinion on all these matters. In fact, I would say that at the end, and that makes me really optimistic about the future of our continent, that yes, in general, you might look at the picture, and the first that you see is very grim and very, very kind of pessimistic tone, right? But then you look at the details and you will find all of these diverse and vital stories of resilience and of resistance and of innovation. And this is where we should look for. So this is my positive message at the end of our conversation.
It's always nice to end on a positive note. So thanks so much, Velina, and I hope to talk to you again in the future. And all the best with all your endeavors.
Thank you very much.